Good evening, Bumblebee folks. I'm Alexa, the resident emo girl, and it's so nice to be back again. Today we're diving into some crazy Pompeii history, which I'll admit was something I wasn't super an expert on until today. I'm more so fixated on Greek history and mythology in high school. Question for y'all. What's your favorite part of history to do a deep dive into? Let me know in the comments, and welcome to the top 10 hardships of ancient Pompeii slaves explained. Number 10, the size of their rooms. I live in one of the most expensive cities in Canada, possibly the entire world, but thankfully I get a pretty good bang for my buck when it comes to the size of my bedroom and what I pay in rent. I do have a friend who currently works on cruise ships, lives in a bunk bed and practically a glorified closet, and I have no idea how she does it. And compared to the slave bedrooms in Pompeii, her room actually looks pretty roomy. Recently, a tiny cramped room with 2 beds but only 1 mattress was discovered in a wealthy suburb some 2,000 feet north of the walls of the ancient Roman city, which was wiped out, nearly 2,000 years ago in AD 79. Interestingly, archaeologists say they found no evidence of grates, locks, or chains to restrain the room's inhabitants, which I'll elaborate on later, I promise. As well as the 2 beds, the room also contained 2 small cabinets and several urns and ceramic containers, in which the remains of 2 mice and a rat were found. These details once again underline the condition of precarity and poor hygiene in which the lower level of society lived in during that time, according to the culture minister of Italy. The first excavations at the Civita Giuliana villa were carried out between 1907 and 1908, although they kind of stopped for a bit and started up again in 2017 to deter robbers. And several relics have been found, including a ceremonial chariot and a stable containing the remains of 3 harnessed horses. Part of one of the beds in the newly discovered room was destroyed by a tunnel used by robbers to access another part of the villa, according to archaeologists. Officials said materials such as furniture and fabric had decomposed over the years after being covered by rock fragments, gas, and ash from Vesuvius, leaving a void in the debris. But when the area was filled with plaster, archaeologists were able to create casts to recover the original shape and contours of the long-gone material, including the outline of a crumpled blanket left on the bed netting. Number 9, being restrained at night. Sadly, this isn't a sleepwalking trend of any kind, just a horrible reality. So starting off with some context, there were 2 main types of slaves, public and private. Public slaves, called servi publici, were owned by the Roman government. They might have worked on public building projects, for a government official, or in the emperor's mines. Whereas private slaves, or servi privati, were owned by an individual and worked jobs such as household servants, laborers on farms, and craftsmen. Now, household slaves were used for a number of jobs, acting as cleaners, cooks, and sometimes tutors. Slaves who worked in agriculture had a tough time, facing hard labor and receiving next to no basic life comfort. They were given the poor living quarters I talked about a moment ago, often chained at night so they wouldn't run away, and then given minimal food and clothing. Life was easier in towns, where slaves worked on construction and repair work, often in the public eye, allowing a greater chance of freedom. With that type of work, they also got very physically fit, which meant they could be sold as a gladiator, and a chance for glory. Which brings me to number 8. Gladiators were slaves. I feel like I've heard about this once before, but it didn't fully register until today. And I'm a gal who freaking loves the cutesy Disney animated version of Hercules. Gladiators were mostly slaves purchased for their strength by local businessmen. They were trained in troops and then hired out to fight in the games. Most were from the lowest ranks of Roman society, being despised as lowly slaves and in the same outcast bracket as ladies of the night and actors. As an actor myself, that statement didn't even sting to say. Oh, by the way, gladiator is a Latin word meaning swordsman. For hundreds of years during the Roman Republic and Roman Empire, the masses were very entertained by these sports. Gladiator games endured for almost 1,000 years, until the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity put a stop to it around the 4th century. The peak of gladiator culture, though, was between the 1st century BC and 2nd century AD. Many gladiators had single names like Princeps and Hilarius, indicating that they were slaves, but some gladiators were also freedmen. So, for example, the gladiator Lucius Ratius Felix was probably a freedman, since Felix was a common slave name, and his other 2 names were most likely adopted from his former master and added to his own name after he was freed. Some occasional gladiators were also just freeborn. Graffiti in Pompeii records the name of a gladiator called Marcus Attilius. This name is not that of a slave and does not indicate he was a freedman, so suggesting he signed up to the arena for profit. There was a chance for the slave gladiators to appease the masses to the point where they were granted their freedom, but it wasn't super common. Number 7, naughty blondes. Excuse me, I'm about to call up my blonde friends to tell them this for a good laugh. So this rule has a lot to do with the Roman obsession with class and social standing. The vast majority of natively born Roman women were dark haired, so blonde hair at the time was associated with the Gauls and barbarians. Body service selling in ancient Roman society was 100% legal, and there were no social repercussions for men who used the services. Those who worked in the field, however, especially the lower class ones, tended to be looked down upon. To make sure that no good and honest Roman woman was mistaken for such a lady, a law was brought in that stated women in this field, many of whom were slaves and had no such choice anyways, had to dye their hair blonde. The thinking was this way they would appear more like the barbaric Gauls rather than the regal Roman ladies. And hey, the law worked for like a little while. Unfortunately for lawmakers, noble Roman women soon started to envy the sexy blonde look. They began either dyeing their hair themselves or demanding that the poor slaves shave their heads so that blonde wigs could be made, which is honestly a pattern that's repeated itself in fashion time and time again. Number 6. Doomed from birthplace. Most slaves are people captured in times of war. As the Roman Empire expanded, they often captured, slaves from new lands that they conquered. Other slaves were bought from slave traders and pirates who captured people from foreign lands and brought them to Rome. Offspring of slave mothers were automatically condemned, with some being born in a city specifically for the purpose of being a slave. Imagine if, in today's world, we were all sentenced to work specifically in a field based off of where we were born, no exceptions. Number 5. Proof of identity, please. So there was like a range of different ways to become a slave. Abandoned young folks, which was high, were picked up off the streets. War captives, like I mentioned before, were very common, as well as criminals from various wrongdoings. Ethnic origin also played a big part, as slave dealers were required to provide proof of the ethnicity of their stock. Certain nationalities, such as Greek, were preferred as slaves and commonly used to tutor a family's offspring. This brought a great status symbol to any particular household who owned a Greek slave. Ancient Rome also got its slaves from, like I said before, prisoners of war, which was common considering they were a powerful military force who won many battles and wars during their expansion. Sailors also, captured and sold pirates if they met them out at sea, or, go on a trip, buy a slave, and then bring them back to the city to trade. Romans, like I said before, were very fond of their hierarchies, and I'll elaborate more now. So take for example that the majority of free Romans were banned from wearing the color purple, since it was associated with glory, power, and royalty. As such, the wearing of a purple toga was reserved for only the emperor and other very high-ranking Romans. And this was mostly because it was crazy expensive to produce purple dye. It was all sourced from Phoenicia, and to make enough dye for one toga, 10,000 mollusks had to be crushed. This meant that pound for pound, purple dye was worth roughly the same as gold. The Romans liked to be able to distinguish a person's class just by looking at them. So the ban on purple togas is a prime example of Roman sumptuary law. These were laws brought in that banned lower class Romans from showing off any wealth they may have. In the Roman class system, you stayed in your place and only the upper classes could flaunt their will. Number 4, joining religion was a maybe. In this wild system where people received no payment for their hard work, but were instead shunned from society, not being allowed to take part in any main cults of religion or, public rituals. Okay, look, as much as I'm not the biggest fan of organized religion, I still think it's anyone's right to have the option to join or shun them. One opinion the Romans and I share when it comes to religion is a dislike for Christianity, by the way. So, why did the Romans have such an issue with the Jews and early Christians for so long? Part of the reason is that Jewish and Christian practices grossed the Romans out. The Romans didn't really approve of the Jewish practice of circumcision, seeing it as a cruel form of genital mutilation. The Romans did some pretty icky things in the name of their gods, but hey, apparently that little bit of skin at the tip of the was a step too far, even for them. Christians, on the other hand, were first seen as people eating red fluid cultists. The Romans didn't get the metaphor and took the flesh of Christ and redness of Christ parts of the Holy Communion a little too seriously, which is a little funny in retrospect. Number 3, family ain't always supportive. I've already touched on the offspring of slaves having to become slaves themselves, but there was something a little worse than that. Roman fathers could sell, or rent out, their sons into slavery, but it was only temporary. The father and prospective buyer would come to an agreement as to the price and duration of the son's slavery, and when the time was up, the buyer was expected to bring the son back in roughly the same condition he had received him in. Like most things in Roman society though, the father could only do this in moderation. He could sell the same son twice and everything was fine. But if he sold the son a third time, he was deemed to be an unfit father. So, sorry dad, 3 strikes and you're out here. Any son who was sold by his father 3 times was legally emancipated from his greedy parents, but only after he'd finished his 3rd stint as a slave. The 3 sales rule applied to each spawn, so if a father wanted to keep making money from his descendants, all he needed to do was keep making more of them. The math isn't mathing for me. Is it for anybody else? Oh, and I almost forgot the worst part. In early Rome, members of a man's family were essentially his possessions. He could do with them what he wished, which explains why he could sell his sons into slavery. It was up to the father to choose how he punished his descendants. If he felt that they deserved to die, then he could kill them without legal repercussions. Even after being married off and leaving the nest, a daughter could still by her father. Sons only became truly independent after being sold 3 times or after their father had died. By the 1st century BC, a man's right to family had been abolished, unless his son was convicted of a crime. Then his dad was still alive. Number 2, you're kinda free. Yeah, slaves were sometimes set free by their owner, which was referred to as manumission. Roman owners freed their slaves in considerable numbers. Some freed them outright, while others allowed them to buy their own freedom, earning the title of being called freedmen or freedwoman. The prospect of possible freedom through manumission encouraged most slaves to be obedient and hardworking. Formal manumission was performed by a magistrate and gave freedmen full Roman citizenship. However, the law gave any offspring born to freedmen after formal manumission full rights of citizenship, including the right to hold office. Although folks who went through manumission still, had the status of a freed slave and were technically considered Roman citizens but couldn't hold public office. Oh, and any property or wealth they accumulated reverted to their former owners when they died, so it's a bit of like a 50-50 situation. And number 1, you don't really have rights. I saved the worst and the most vague for the end of our list today, even though I'm pretty sure it was obvious by this point in the list. Slaves' lives were cruel, with their level of cruelty being much dependent on who owned them. Skilled individuals who helped their masters with business matters became trusted, and therefore treated well with the hope of freedom, whereas other slaves were punished and chained in their position. Some did try to speak out against slavery, but it was just too essential to Rome's progress. One poet and philosopher, Seneca, argued that slaves should at least be treated fairly. You could be sent to be punished to death or by your owner on a whim. But thankfully we as a society have done away with that now. And that brings us to the end of our time, and I'm super glad I live in the present where I'm not as worried about my life. If you enjoyed today, could you help us out by giving this video a like, subscribing if you aren't already, hit the bell so you never miss a video, and I'll see y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.